States, you'll find out that the 18th Amendment went into effect, which was prohibition, which put severe restrictions on the use of alcoholic beverages. Obviously, by Mr. White's standards, if you were studying American history, you would conclude that alcohol was introduced into the United States in the 1920s because there's no reference to it earlier in the Constitution. So therefore, since there was no reference to it earlier, it didn't exist. And since the 21st Amendment went into effect in 1933, repealing this, you have to conclude that all alcohol vanished from the United States because the law was there no longer relevant. The point is simply this: the lack of documentation proves nothing. We do not know how George Washington celebrated his 50th birthday. We do not know what Abraham Lincoln got on his 16th birthday from his parents. That doesn't mean that George Washington didn't last past 50, and doesn't mean Abraham Lincoln didn't have both of his parents alive at age 16. These are simply things that were not recorded and not put down. But the fact both of those men celebrated birthdays past the 16th and past their 50th birthday. Whether they received presents or not, I don't know, and I don't care. The point is simply this: the argument is sort of a variation of the argument from silence. If there were no documentation of no church father advocating what I advocate, it would prove nothing. And again, since none of these fathers individually were infallible, it would prove nothing even if they supported Mr. White's own position. The key element here does come down to, as I said before, in a sense, claims. I claim to be infallible because I claim to be speaking the truth, and I've demonstrated it during this debate. I've answered questions yes or no directly. I haven't evaded, and I confronted face-to-face my opponent. My opponent dodged, evaded, stalled, and ran away. By definition, if he was not afraid of his arguments and their conclusions, if he had truth on his side, if he had called on God first, he would have behaved in the way I would have behaved, and we would have had an argument or a disagreement. But remember, one of my proofs was who's going to win the debate. He who runs away on the battlefield and leaves the battlefield to his opponent, by definition, loses. There's no way Napoleon can claim that the Battle of Waterloo was a win, because he deserted his troops and he fled from the battle. Mr. White deserted his claims, deserted his conclusions, refused to comment on his history, and left the field to me. And remember, I said each one of my arguments separately would sustain my position. The fact that I won proves that I was right, because remember, God got involved today. You witnessed a divine intervention in the affairs of man simply because I asked him for his assistance. So, once again, Mr. White's claims of history, conclusion, and claims all fail. And that's all he offered. He offered nothing against me. He offered nothing to oppose my arguments on miracle or my arguments on Scripture. He even admitted that the keys were given to St. Peter. So what we have is, number one, what he did not admit was right on my side, he either ignored or attacked fruitlessly. The victory was mine. The truth is mine. The church is mine. Go ahead, Lee.
Okay, Professor White, it's your turn for a 2.5-minute closing.
Thank you very much. Mr. Lewis just said that only conciliar statements approved by the Pope are valid conciliar statements from councils. I would like to use this as an example of the irrationality of the arguments that Mr. Lewis has been using. First of all, it's an anachronism. No one believed that at the time of Nicaea. No one believed that at the time of Chalcedon, and Mr. Lewis can't show us that they did. Hence, he is arguing from an anachronism. Secondly, it's a circular argument. It assumes what he has yet to prove, and that is the Pope has been established to do what Mr. Lewis says. And finally, he's incorrect, and that is because Nicaea has been established by every pope that has ever lived, and hence the Sixth Canon would establish those things. Mr. Lewis simply can't deal with the conciliar data. Now, he then, when he attempts to talk about the quote-unquote arguments from silence, he says these things are simply things that were not written down. I'd like people to realize what Mr. Lewis is saying is that in the hundreds of books written by hundreds of church leaders, like Cyprian and Athanasius and John Chrysostom, about every aspect of theology, every aspect of ecclesiology, the very foundational element of the church, the very definitional element of the church, goes without mention, left only to Vincent Lewis to discover many, many years later. My friends, Mr. Lewis says I left the battlefield. I think any logical or rational person who listens to this debate will have to come to the same conclusion that I have. Mr. Lewis never showed up on the battlefield. I'm over on the battlefield of rationality, of the Bible, and of history. Mr. Lewis is in his own fantasy world where his word becomes the final word. I'm not on his battlefield. He's right about that. But I will be very, very happy to stand right here on the battlefield of what the Bible teaches, of what history has proclaimed, and say, Mr. Lewis, you may feel that you've won. In fact, I think you feel you've won every debate you've ever been in. But the simple fact of the matter is, when people listen to these tapes, when they listen to this broadcast, I will trust them. I will trust the Spirit of God to work in their lives, because I did call upon the Lord to help me today, Mr. Lewis, and he did. You may not know it, you may not want to believe it, but those are the facts. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll sort of spin off what my opponent said. Remember, if he called on God, which he claims he did, and remember the words of Jesus, yet your yes be yes and your no be no, and anything else is from Satan. Remember the frequent passages in Isaiah and Jeremiah about confronting your opponents. And then look, if he called upon God, and if God helped him, why did he reject it? But I think even far more important is the point of this. Mr. White clearly says, you don't have to believe what he says. It really doesn't matter. There's no penalty, because there's no penalty for rejecting human fabrication, theory, and supposition. I state it again. I presented God's truth. Reject it at your peril, which means your damnation. Mr. White did not present it that way, does not present it that way. If he called on God to help him, for heaven's sakes, why didn't he present the truth, which is necessary for salvation? I don't know. Well, of course I do, because he didn't have it by his own admission. And I would say that's a good summary statement. I spoke the truth. I demand you accept it. He spoke supposition, doesn't particularly care whether you accept it or not. Thank you, Lee, and thank you, Mr. White.
The next debate with Mr. Lewis was on the topic of purgatory and indulgences. As the listener will hear, this debate did not go nearly as smoothly as the first. Due to the egregious breaches of any kind of scholarly decorum by Mr. Lewis during the cross-examination period, in which he constantly asked absurd questions, made statements under the guise of questions, etc., the time limits of the debate were overrun. To fit the debate within the limitations of the second tape requires that we skip over the initial 2-minute opening statements and the closing 2.5-minute statements. Since no new material or argumentation was presented in either, and since Mr. Lewis went over time in both, no loss of real information is incurred by moving directly to the primary expositions. Get a deep seat in the saddle, as this one gets pretty wild.
Thank you. All right, what I shall present in this is 4 arguments. I will name them now, which will make it easier for both my opponent